The sound of a phone call was the last thing Nathan Ward ever wanted to hear. It wasn't the first time he'd been in the spotlight, but this moment was different. This time, the cameras were pointed in his direction for all the wrong reasons. The headlines exploded across every screen. Nathan Ward, billionaire CEO, accused of massive financial fraud. His company, Ward Tech, a global empire, was built on promises of innovation, progress, and trust. But now it was crumbling before him, and just like that, his perfect world of mansions, private jets, and exclusive dinners was about to disappear in a cloud of scandal. The phone buzzed again on his desk, the same way it had when he had sealed deals in boardrooms, earned accolades, or made high-stakes decisions. Now it was just noise, a reminder that everything was collapsing around him. "Mr. Ward," a voice on the other end said, breaking through the panic, "you need to come down to the office. The board is calling for a meeting." Nathan stood up slowly, staring at his reflection in the polished glass of the window. His face had aged years in just a matter of days. What was once the face of a confident mogul now looked like a man stripped bare of everything he had ever known. The weight of betrayal from his closest partners, the allegations of embezzlement, the questions about tax evasion, it was all out there, exposed for the world to see. He stepped into his shoes, the thick leather feeling heavier than ever. He reached for his coat and buttoned it, but the fabric felt too stiff, too formal for what he was about to face. The world he had spent decades constructing, a tower of wealth and influence, was falling apart with every new accusation. Nathan Ward had built his empire from the ground up, grinding through sleepless nights, countless deals and impossible decisions, and now it was all going to be torn apart. The scandal was more than just bad press. It was a personal betrayal, one that had come from within. His closest allies had been feeding off his success, lining their pockets with the same corruption that now threatened to end his career. As the black sedan pulled up to the headquarters of Ward Tech, the once proud building seemed to stand in mock defiance of his fall. He had watched this company grow from a startup in a small apartment to a giant in the tech world, but now it was like a collapsing castle, its towers of glass and steel betraying the truth beneath. Inside, the room was already filled with tense faces, board members who had been friends and colleagues for years. But now they looked at him with suspicion, fear, and something worse, disappointment. The man who had stood at the center of their wealth was now a liability, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Nathan sat down in the cold, sterile chair in front of them, his eyes scanning the room, looking for any hint of the trust that once held them together. But there was nothing, just sharp glances, whispers, and silence. He felt the weight of their stares like 1,000 pounds pressing on his chest. "We need you to step down, Nathan," one of them said finally, his voice flat. The words hit Nathan like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't just the business that was falling apart. It was his entire life. The lavish dinners, the private parties, the constant praise. It had all been smoke and mirrors. Now, it was nothing but dust in the wind. He stood up without a word, his mind spinning, his body stiff. The life he had built from nothing was now unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Nathan walked out of the room, the weight of the world pressing down on him, he realized this was only the beginning. Nathan Ward sat alone in a corner booth, the dim light from the overhead lamp flickering above him. He hadn't been here in years, not since his early days when he worked endless hours in a tiny office with nothing but a dream. But tonight, nothing about the room felt familiar. The worn leather of the booth, the cracked salt shaker, the hum of the old jukebox in the corner. Everything felt foreign, out of place. His empire, the one he had spent years building, was slipping through his fingers like sand. The announcement of his resignation would come in the morning. The thought of it twisted in his chest like a dull knife. The press, the board, his own colleagues, they had all turned on him. But what hurt most wasn't the fall from wealth, or even the power he had lost. It was the emptiness that lingered after everything had collapsed. His marriage had crumbled too, the one he had built to look perfect like everything else. The betrayal from those closest to him still echoed in his mind. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of the table, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. The glass of water in front of him sat untouched, the ice cubes slowly melting. He could feel the weight of the coming storm pressing down on him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed was coming to an end. Nathan wasn't used to being in places like this, places where people didn't know who he was. His world was filled with five-star dinners, suits, and meetings in skyscrapers. This diner, with its cracked walls and the faint smell of grease, was a far cry from the polished offices of WardTech. He felt small here, as if the weight of his failure was somehow amplified by the ordinary world around him. It was as though, in this moment, he was being forced to face the man he had become. The waitress appeared at his table, her presence soft but undeniable. Aisha. Her name was stitched on the pocket of her apron. She was young, her skin a deep shade of brown, and her eyes held a quiet wisdom that was unsettling. She didn't look at him with awe like others did. There was no recognition in her gaze, no judgment, only a calm that seemed to stretch beyond the small, cramped space they shared. "Can I get you something to eat?" she asked, her voice steady. Nathan looked at the menu for a moment but didn't really see it. He felt the weight of her question more than anything. She wasn't asking out of obligation. It was more of a quiet invitation to something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. "I'll just have the steak," he muttered, his voice hollow, barely more than a whisper. Aisha nodded, a simple, polite gesture. But there was something in her eyes, a stillness, a kind of quiet strength that made Nathan pause. She was a stranger, and yet in her presence, for a brief moment, he felt like she saw him, really saw him. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, just the man who had failed, who was now unsure of what came next. She turned to leave, but then hesitated. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes we're all just one mistake away from losing everything. But that doesn't mean you can't start over." Nathan blinked, surprised by her words. But before he could respond, she was gone, slipping quietly into the bustle of the diner. The words lingered, echoing in his mind. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew it had struck a chord deep inside him. The calmness in her eyes, the certainty of her voice. It was like a mirror reflecting the fear and regret he had kept buried for so long. As Aisha disappeared into the kitchen, Nathan sat back in his booth, staring at the empty plate in front of him. His life, once full of ambition and certainty, now felt like a series of hollow echoes. Yet in that moment, something in him stirred, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A small flicker of hope. He didn't know why, but he found himself wanting to understand her, to know the source of that quiet strength. The silence in the diner was no longer oppressive. It was as though a new possibility had quietly entered the room, one he couldn't ignore. But Nathan couldn't help noticing the unfamiliar calm that lingered in Aisha's eyes. It was a strength that, for the first time in months, he felt he might need. The streets of her neighborhood smelled like asphalt and old rain. It wasn't a place that anyone would choose to live, but for Aisha, it was home. Aisha had learned early that life didn't give handouts. You had to take what you could, even if the world around you seemed determined to take it back. She had grown up in a small, crowded apartment with her mother, her two younger sisters, and her baby brother Jaden. They didn't have much, but they had each other. The apartment was cramped, the walls thin, and the windows barely opened. Still, it was theirs. And in a world where nothing ever seemed to go right, that small corner of the city was everything. Her mother, a woman with fierce, silent strength, worked long hours as a nurse, barely scraping by. Aisha would often wake before the sun, helping to make breakfast, packing lunch, and then rushing off to school. Afterward, she worked shifts at the diner, serving coffee and filling orders. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But she did it because she had to. The night Jaden died was the night Aisha learned that no one ever really gets what they deserve. Jaden was just 9 years old. He was full of life, a funny little kid who would chase after her in the hallways, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. Aisha had promised him they would go see a movie that weekend. Something to get away from the stress of life. Something to remind them of joy. But the night before the movie, Jaden was caught in a random act of violence. A drive-by shooting. It wasn't personal. It wasn't even meant for him. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Aisha never got to keep that promise. She never got to take him to the movie. The loss crushed her, but even worse was the aftermath. There were no answers. The police were as uninterested in solving the case as they were in looking after the families like hers. They couldn't even give her a reason why or a face to place the blame on. It was just another casualty, another statistic that no one cared to remember. Her mother became a shell of the woman she once was. She worked even harder, hoping to bury her grief in long hours and late nights. But Aisha couldn't let go of the anger. It wasn't just the injustice of it all. It was the way the world had abandoned them. People who lived in wealth, like the ones who passed by in their shiny cars, didn't have to worry about their little brothers getting shot on a random street corner. People who didn't look like Aisha had the power to make decisions that affected her whole life. Aisha couldn't change the world. Not all at once, but she knew she could at least find the small acts that made a difference. So she kept going. She kept working at the diner, serving customers with a smile, even when she didn't feel like smiling. She knew how to hide the hurt. It was a skill she'd developed early, but there was something else. A quiet fire that had burned inside her ever since that night. It was the belief that people, every single person, deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, and that was why she kept her eyes open, no matter how low she felt. She saw people in ways they couldn't see themselves. She saw Nathan, even when he couldn't see past his own empire, his own fall. She saw his brokenness, the way he sat alone in a diner disconnected from the world, as though everything he had was slipping through his fingers. She wasn't going to fix him, but she could offer him something no one else seemed to be offering: understanding. The same understanding she wished someone had given her when she lost Jaden. Aisha knew what it felt like to lose everything, but she also knew what it meant to fight for the pieces that remained. Even if they were small, even if they didn't look like much, the diner felt different this time. The stale scent of coffee and grease in the air, the worn-out booths, the hum of the old jukebox, all of it seemed to press down on Nathan as he stepped inside. It was a place he'd never thought he'd return to, yet here he was. The weight of his collapse clung to him, tighter than his expensive suit. The city outside was a blur, the lights harsh and indifferent, like the world was already forgetting who he was. Aisha was behind the counter again, her movements fluid, unhurried. She looked up when he walked in, her gaze steady, neither welcoming nor cold. She didn't know it yet, but this was the night everything would change. Nathan hesitated, as if the threshold of the diner might swallow him whole. His fingers twitched, a habit, a nervous tick. The empire he'd built, the millions, the power, all of it felt like a distant memory, a far-off dream. All that remained was this uncomfortable reality: a man stripped bare, walking through a door into a world that didn't belong to him anymore. He slid into the same booth as before, the worn vinyl creaking under his weight. He didn't expect her to approach again, but Aisha did. Her presence was calm, almost serene, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He'd spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Yet here, in this quiet diner, was someone who didn't look at him with admiration, fear, or even curiosity. She just looked at him. "Can I get you something?" Aisha asked, her voice steady. He nodded without looking up. Same as last time. She didn't move, not immediately. Instead, she watched him for a moment, as if measuring something. Maybe it was his silence. Maybe it was the way his shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on them. "You look different tonight," she said after a beat. Nathan's fingers tensed around the edge of the table. It wasn't the first time someone had noticed, but in her voice, quiet, unforced, he felt it in a way he hadn't before. He didn't respond right away. His eyes wandered over the table, the chipped cup of coffee, the empty plate. The room felt suffocating in a way he couldn't escape. "I don't know where to begin," he finally said, his voice low, the words heavy in his chest. "Everything I built, it's all falling apart. I didn't see it coming." Aisha didn't interrupt. She simply nodded as if she already understood. Her gaze was unwavering, but it wasn't the kind of look that demanded answers or sympathy. It was something else, an understanding, almost like she was waiting for him to say what he needed to say, without pressuring him to hurry. "The company's a mess," Nathan continued, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "I was so focused on growth, on being the biggest, the best. But now it feels like everything's been built on sand. I should have seen it coming. All the lies, The greed, my board, they turned on me. He paused, the words a bitter taste in his mouth. I thought I could control it all, but now it's too late. There was a long silence. Aisha didn't speak. She didn't offer advice or try to fix anything. She just waited, her presence steady like a rock in a storm. The quiet stretched between them. Nathan's chest tightened as he felt the weight of her gaze. For the first time in days, he didn't feel the urge to defend himself, to fight back. For the first time in days, he didn't feel the need to pretend. It's not just the company, Nathan added, almost to himself. It's everything. My marriage, the people I trusted. They've all turned their backs. I'm alone in this. I have nothing left. No one left. Aisha finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. You're not the only one who's lost something, you know. She didn't offer a sad smile. There was no pity in her eyes. Just truth. Nathan met her gaze, the words she'd said settling like stones in his chest. She didn't speak like others who tried to make him feel better with empty promises. She wasn't offering comfort. She was just telling him that she understood. She had lost something too. Her quiet strength echoed in the air between them, a contrast to the chaos Nathan felt inside. Here was a woman who had faced loss, who had lived with pain, and yet she stood in front of him unbroken. Something about that struck him. How easy it would have been for her to fall into bitterness, but she hadn't. She still believed in something more, something better, something human. You've been through something, Nathan said, his voice raw. But you're still here. You're still standing. Aisha's eyes softened just a fraction. She turned, heading toward the kitchen to put in his order, but something had shifted between them. The silence that had once been oppressive was now filled with something else, understanding. And as Aisha walked away, Nathan didn't feel the usual weight of shame pressing down on him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt seen. Not for his success or his failure, but for the person he was in that moment. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. In the quiet hum of the diner, a bond had been formed, a silent understanding that would change everything. Aisha hadn't said much, but Nathan knew in that instant that she would help him in a way no one else could. She had made a decision, unspoken yet clear. She would not walk away. She would offer him something that no amount of money or power could buy, a chance at redemption. Aisha sat in the back booth of the diner, her eyes scanning the newspaper in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. The faint clink of cups and the low murmur of conversations around her were nothing but background noise. She had a plan, one that would change everything. But it wasn't just about Nathan. It was bigger than that. She had watched the news reports about the scandal, listened to the media tear Nathan Ward apart. But something about the way he'd opened up to her, the vulnerability, the guilt, had stuck with her. People like Nathan weren't used to being seen, truly seen for who they were underneath the success. She saw it, though, and now she couldn't walk away. She knew she had to do something, but taking action meant stepping into dangerous territory. Aisha wasn't naive. She knew the risks. Nathan's fall wasn't just a personal failure. It was the unraveling of something far more sinister, something that had been festering under the surface of WardTech for years. Using her connections from the diner, Aisha quietly began to piece things together. She'd overheard enough conversations from regulars who came in late at night, corporate types who thought they were invisible, their voices thick with secrets. They didn't know she was listening, but she had learned to hear things that others missed. The subtle shift in tone when people talked about Nathan's downfall, the way they hesitated when they mentioned his name. It was enough to make her question the official story. Aisha dug deeper. She didn't have the resources or the access to the kind of corporate files Nathan had once had, but she had something just as valuable: street smarts. She knew how to talk to people, how to make them feel like they were in control while she quietly pulled the strings. And when you spent your life surviving in a world that didn't give a damn about you, you learned how to get answers, even when people tried to hide them. It was during one of her late-night shifts at the diner that the breakthrough came. A regular, a man named Jared, who worked as a mid-level exec in Nathan's company, sat down at the counter. He was drunk as usual, and didn't seem to notice when Aisha leaned in closer, offering him a refill. He slurred his words, but Aisha caught enough. "They set him up, you know," Jared muttered between sips of coffee. Nathan had no idea. "They're gonna pin it all on him, make him the fall guy." Aisha's pulse quickened. She had heard enough. Jared's words confirmed what she'd suspected. The scandal wasn't just a series of mistakes. It was a plot, a conspiracy. But who would stand to gain from framing Nathan? The answer came soon after. Aisha dug further, learning that the person behind it all was someone close to Nathan, a man who had been a partner, a trusted ally. Victor Crane. He was one of Nathan's longest-serving business partners, a man who had climbed the corporate ladder right beside him. Crane had always been the quiet one, the man who stayed in the background, letting Nathan take the spotlight. But now, Aisha realized, he was the one pulling the strings. Crane had orchestrated the financial manipulation that led to Nathan's downfall, using the company's resources to line his own pockets while hiding behind Nathan's reputation. It was Crane's betrayal, his greed, that had caused everything to implode. And now Nathan was left holding the bag, his name dragged through the mud, his career in ruins. Aisha's heart tightened as she pieced it all together. She wasn't just going to clear Nathan's name. She was going to expose Crane for what he truly was, a thief, a liar, and a manipulator. But doing so would come with a price. Crane wouldn't go down without a fight. And Aisha knew that this kind of exposure could put both her and Nathan in grave danger. She sat back in her booth, her mind racing. This was bigger than just taking down a corrupt businessman. This was about revealing the truth, about showing the world that even the most powerful weren't untouchable. Aisha had been raised on the idea that justice was hard to come by for people like her. But now she had the chance to change that, for Nathan and for herself. Her eyes shifted to the diner's clock. It was late, but she couldn't afford to wait. Tomorrow she would take the next step. The confrontation would happen soon, and it would be dangerous. But Aisha was ready. She had nothing to lose and everything to gain. As she rose from the booth, she felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. The truth was coming, and there would be no turning back. But for the first time in a long time, Aisha felt a sense of purpose, a quiet certainty that this was the right path. Tomorrow the truth would be exposed, and there was no going back. Aisha knew she was getting too close, but she couldn't stop. The truth was pulling her deeper into a maze of lies, and each step she took only made it harder to turn back. She had spent days gathering information, quiet conversations, late-night research, and whispered exchanges. Every piece of evidence she uncovered seemed to confirm her suspicions. Nathan had been set up, but by someone he trusted, someone close enough to see everything unfold. It wasn't just corporate mismanagement or a few bad decisions. It was a well-orchestrated plot, designed to bring down the very man who had built the empire. The deeper Aisha went, the more dangerous things became. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was keeping track of her every move. The diner had always been a safe space for her, until now. As she scrolled through files on her phone late one evening, she noticed a shadow in the window, a silhouette that lingered a moment too long before disappearing. It wasn't just strangers she had to worry about. Aisha began to sense resistance from places she didn't expect. Friends, colleagues, even her own family seemed to be pulling away. Her mother, who had always taught her to fight for what was right, had begun to worry. "This is too dangerous, Aisha. Stay out of it. It's not your fight." But Aisha couldn't turn away. She had seen the way Nathan's face had changed when he spoke of his downfall. The guilt, the regret. She had seen that same look in her own eyes after losing Jaden. They were both products of a system that devoured everything it touched. Nathan's empire wasn't just a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of everything broken in a world that chewed people up and spit them out. Each new piece of evidence confirmed something darker. Victor Crane, Nathan's longtime business partner, was the mastermind behind it all. The financial manipulations, the offshore accounts, the mysterious transactions. Crane had pulled the strings from the shadows, using Nathan's name and reputation to cover his tracks. But it wasn't just greed, it was power. Crane wanted control of the company, and Nathan's fall was the price. Aisha had to act. She gathered the final pieces, emails, recorded conversations, internal memos, and compiled them into a damning file. She knew it was time to confront Nathan, but the weight of the truth threatened to overwhelm her. Exposing Crane's conspiracy meant risking everything: Nathan's career, their safety, and the fragile trust that had begun to form between them. She wasn't sure if Nathan could handle the full weight of the truth, but she knew it had to be done. The next day, she met Nathan at the diner. He was waiting for her in the same booth, his face drawn, the exhaustion of the past few weeks still visible in the lines of his face. He didn't say anything when she sat down, but his eyes met hers, full of silent questions. Aisha didn't waste time. She slid the folder across the table, her fingers brushing the edges. Nathan stared at it, then at her, as if trying to decide whether he was ready for what he knew was coming. "You were right," she said quietly. "It wasn't just bad luck or mistakes. It was Victor. He set you up, Nathan." Nathan's face paled as he opened the folder. His eyes moved over the documents, each word sinking deeper into him, until he couldn't look anymore. The weight of the betrayal, his partner, his closest ally, was almost more than he could bear. He had spent years trusting Crane, believing in him. To think that everything he'd worked for had been destroyed not by his own hand, but by someone who had used him, who had played him like a pawn, it was too much. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. "I never saw it. Never saw him for what he was," he muttered, disbelief still etched in his voice. Aisha leaned back in her seat, watching him. She wasn't offering comfort. This wasn't about making him feel better. This was about the truth, no matter how ugly it was. "Now you know. You can't go back. You can't protect the company anymore, Nathan." "Not the way it was," Aisha said. "But you can expose it. You can expose Crane for what he is. That's the only way forward." Nathan closed the folder slowly, his mind racing. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "If I expose him, I'll lose everything. The company, my reputation." Aisha's gaze was steady, unwavering. "What's left of your reputation? What's left of this empire? You think they'll forgive you for not seeing it sooner?" The silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of what he had to decide. He was a man caught between two worlds, the one he had built, the one he had loved, and the one that had been taken from him. There was no easy way out, but the truth, Aisha's truth, was the only way forward. Nathan sat there for a long time, his eyes lost in the pages of the folder. The room around them seemed to close in, the weight of the decision pressing on him from all sides. Expose the truth and risk everything, or protect the remnants of a broken empire and live with the guilt of knowing what he had lost. As he stood up, Aisha didn't speak. She didn't need to. The choice had been made. Tomorrow, Nathan would confront the truth, and there was no turning back. The conference room was cold, the lights above too bright, too harsh. Nathan Ward sat at the head of the polished glass table, his hands folded tightly in front of him, his jaw clenched. Beside him sat Aisha, her calm presence an anchor in the storm. Across from them, the people who had orchestrated his downfall stood with their carefully crafted facades. Victor Crane, the man Nathan had trusted like a brother, and the other board members, their faces masked with feigned innocence. It was the first time in weeks that Nathan had stood tall, not as a fallen CEO, but as a man determined to take control of his own fate. He wasn't sure he could win this battle, but he knew that sitting back and letting them lie their way out wasn't an option anymore. The truth had a way of becoming impossible to ignore. And now it was all he had. The file lay in front of him. The evidence they'd gathered, emails, bank records, testimonies, all meticulously compiled into a weapon that would destroy everything these people had worked to cover up. Aisha's steady gaze never wavered as she sat next to him, a silent partner in this fight. She hadn't said much since they walked in, but she didn't need to. Her presence was enough. It was a reminder to Nathan of why he was here. She wasn't just standing up for him. She was standing up for something larger, something that had been broken long before Nathan ever stepped into that boardroom. Crane finally spoke, his voice smooth, trying to hide the unease that flickered behind his carefully constructed demeanor. "Nathan," he said, "this isn't the way to handle this. We've been through a lot together. Let's talk this through." There's no need for drastic measures. Aisha's eyes never left him. She was the first to speak. There's nothing to talk about. The truth is already out. You've used Nathan to build your empire, and now you think you can walk away without consequences. Doesn't work like that. The words hit harder than expected. Crane's posture stiffened, his hand twitching toward the folder in front of him, but he didn't touch it. He knew what was inside. He knew it could end everything. Nathan took a deep breath, his voice shaking slightly as he broke the silence. I spent years building something I thought was real. I trusted people I shouldn't have. I turned a blind eye. But I won't anymore. This isn't about saving my career. It's about doing what's right. And the truth is, Victor, you've been pulling the strings all along. You were the one who set this up. You were the one who made me the fall guy. Crane's eyes flashed with something. Anger, maybe, or fear. You're making a mistake, he said quickly, his tone rising, but Nathan didn't flinch. For the first time, the words he spoke weren't empty. They had weight, and that was something Crane wasn't used to. Aisha placed a hand on the file in front of Nathan, as though to remind him of what they were holding, what they had on Crane. She didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. You underestimated us, she said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. You thought Nathan was your pawn, but now he's not the one who's going down. You are. The tension in the room grew thicker. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if it too was waiting for the next move. Nathan felt it deep in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation anymore. He was fighting for something that mattered more. He was fighting for the people who had been hurt, for the ones who'd never had a voice. Crane stood up suddenly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. You don't know what you're doing, he spat. You can't just walk away from this. I built this company. I built it with my hands, and you're just some disgraced CEO who thinks he can ruin everything. Nathan stood too, his legs unsteady but firm. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this room hours ago. I'm not ruining anything, Victor. I'm exposing the truth. You are. The confrontation was no longer a negotiation. It was a reckoning. The moral weight of it pressed down on everyone. The guilt of lies and manipulation hanging in the air like smoke. Aisha remained silent, but her unwavering support anchored Nathan. He didn't have to carry the weight of this fight alone anymore. Nathan looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the board members, all of them silent now. Their fear was palpable. They knew what was coming. They could see the finality in Nathan's eyes. He was done running, done hiding behind the illusion of power. He turned back to Crane. You'll be exposed. Every single one of you. And no matter how much you try to cover it up, the truth will come out. I'll make sure of it. The room fell silent. Crane's mouth worked, but no words came out. He knew Nathan was right. He knew the game was over. As Nathan gathered the evidence and stood to leave, a quiet certainty filled the space between him and Aisha. He wasn't walking away empty-handed. He wasn't just taking down the man who had betrayed him. He was taking down a system of corruption that had infected everything. Everyone he had ever trusted. And in doing so, he was reclaiming something he had lost long ago, his sense of justice, his ability to do what was right. Nathan's voice was steady as he looked at Aisha. Let's end this. And for the first time in months, Nathan felt like he had the power to make things right, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been swept up in this lie. The confrontation had ended, but the real battle was just beginning. The press conference was a spectacle. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled for the best angles, and the world watched as Nathan Ward stood at the podium, his name now synonymous with scandal. But today, for the first time in weeks, Nathan felt something different stir inside him. Not fear, not guilt, but something like resolve. The past was unraveling in front of him, but the future was still waiting, and he was going to shape it. He cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his life building an empire, crafting an image of invulnerability, of success. But the man standing before the world now was nothing like the one who had once ruled his company. This man was broken, but in his brokenness, Nathan had found a truth he couldn't ignore. I stand before you today not as the CEO of Ward Tech, Nathan began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had learned. But as someone who was wronged, a man who failed to see the rot in the system he helped create. But that ends now. The room went still. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Nathan continued, his gaze focused on the crowd. Not with the arrogance of the billionaire he once was, but with the humility of a man who had learned something far more valuable than wealth. It wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one who was betrayed, he said, his voice rising with a quiet passion. There are people who have been hurt by the corruption I failed to see. And now I will make it right. The room erupted in questions, but Nathan didn't flinch. He had already made his decision. The evidence he had gathered, the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him, was now out in the open. Victor Crane, the man who had pulled the strings behind the scenes, was exposed for what he was, a manipulative, self-serving liar who had used Nathan's reputation to hide his crimes. The scandal was undeniable. The truth had shattered the lies, and Nathan's name, once tarnished beyond recognition, was slowly being restored. But the real change wasn't in the headlines or the media coverage. It was in Nathan himself. He stepped down from his position as CEO not out of defeat, but out of responsibility. The company he had once built with pride was no longer his to lead. It had been poisoned by greed, and Nathan knew that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fix it from within. Instead, he turned his focus outward, using the wealth and influence he still had to create something new. A foundation dedicated to promoting ethical corporate governance, transparency, and accountability. A way to help prevent what had happened to him from ever happening to anyone else. Aisha, who had watched from the sidelines, remained largely in the background, refusing to take credit for the role she had played in exposing the truth. She never sought recognition. She wasn't interested in the praise or the media attention. Her fight had never been about Nathan. It had always been about justice, about seeing the system for what it truly was, and finding a way to change it. As the days passed and Nathan's foundation began to take shape, Aisha continued with her life, quietly working at the diner, the place where it all began. She had never expected to be part of a revolution. But when she saw the change in Nathan, the way he had taken his mistakes and used them for something greater, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't about the money or the accolades. It was about the fact that a man had been given a second chance, and he was using it to rebuild the very world that had broken him. Nathan sat in his new office, the one in the foundation looking out over the city. The glass walls gave him a clear view of the skyline, but now it didn't feel as distant. It felt real. Everything that had been taken from him, the power, the wealth, the empire, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered now was the work ahead, the people he could help, the change he could drive. As he sat there, reflecting on the path that had led him here, Nathan realized something. His redemption hadn't come through the restoration of his wealth or his position. It hadn't come through the forgiveness of the board members or the public. His redemption had come through Aisha, a woman he barely knew, who had believed in the truth when no one else did. She had seen him when he couldn't see himself, and in doing so, she had changed his life forever. He leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. This was the beginning of something new, something good, not because of what he had built, but because of what he was willing to rebuild. And for the first time, Nathan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The world had been shaken by the truth, but for Nathan, the real change was within. And it was only the beginning. The city had moved on. Headlines changed. Faces shifted in and out of the spotlight, and the world continued to turn. But Nathan Ward knew that things would never be the same for him, not just because his name had been cleared, or because he had found redemption in ways he never expected, but because he had learned something that no amount of money or power could ever teach him: the true weight of justice. His life had once been defined by an insatiable hunger for more money, more control, more recognition. But the fall from grace had shattered that vision, leaving him with a deeper understanding of what really mattered. The foundation he had created, aimed at promoting transparency and ethical governance, had already started to make waves. But it wasn't the programs or the policies or the wealth that had come with it. It was the realization that he was finally giving something back to the world that he had taken so much from. Nathan stood at the window of his new office, looking out over the city he had once conquered. The skyline before him, gleaming with the morning light, now felt like something he could barely touch. The world was bigger than the boardrooms, the deals, the high-stakes power games. He had learned that the most powerful change often came from the smallest acts of integrity, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but had the power to ripple outward, creating waves that no one saw coming. Across town, Aisha had returned to her life, her ordinary life. The diner, a place where their paths had first crossed, still hummed with its familiar rhythm. Plates clattering, coffee being poured, the soft buzz of quiet conversation. To anyone else, it was just another diner in a city filled with them. But Aisha knew the truth. In that unremarkable space, in the quiet corner where she had offered Nathan a simple truth, something extraordinary had begun. Her choice to act when no one else would, her decision to confront the corruption she saw, had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. She hadn't done it for fame. She hadn't done it for a paycheck. She had done it because she believed in something. Aisha understood that the real measure of a person's worth wasn't in their social standing or their wealth, but in the legacy they left behind. And as she stood at the counter of the diner, wiping down a table, she realized something. Her legacy wasn't in the headlines or the interviews or the applause. It was in the lives she had touched, Nathan's life, the people in her community, and anyone who had ever believed that one small act of courage could make a difference. The diner was still there, still the same as it had always been. But now, to Aisha, it was a symbol of something much greater, a place where, in the smallest of moments, a single act of integrity had turned the tide of an entire life. As she watched Nathan's story unfold on the news, a quiet smile tugged at her lips. She hadn't sought recognition. She hadn't expected anything in return. But knowing that the world was shifting because of her simple belief in what was right, that was enough. In that, she had found her peace. The world would continue to turn. The headlines would change. But the truth of what had happened would live on in the legacy of those who dared to act. In the lives they touched, in the justice they fought for, and in the courage they showed when the world asked them to turn away. Aisha knew now that justice wasn't just about the big moments. It was about every small decision, every act of integrity, that slowly but surely changed the course of history.